Welcome to Exam Bytes Academy's SPPANRSS lesson for non-verbal reasoning. Now, just like in life, when you go shopping, when you do a recipe, you have checklists. In non-verbal, it really helps to have a checklist to help you eliminate answers and find the right answer very quickly. So for that, we use SPPANRSS, which just stands for shape, pattern, position, angle, number, rotation, size, and symmetry. Today's lesson, we're going to be looking at shape, so let's jump into it. When we're looking at shape, we're going to be looking at lots of different criteria, but in a specific order. We start off with types of shapes. We see if a type of shape is more common across our question compared to any other. So perhaps they're more circular shapes, perhaps they're more triangular shapes, perhaps they're more square type shapes or rectangular shapes. So of course, as you can see, these are all different types of shapes. We wouldn't lump them all together. Now, if that doesn't work, then we go on to our next one, which is presence of a shape. So let's have a look at this type of question, which is an odd one out question. We start off in the first square, and we are trying to find out which square is the odd one out. And we're just trying to find the rule within each square. So in this square, we see an arrow, and we see a four-sided shape. Remember, start off general when you're trying to make rules. Then we go on to the second square because we need to be able to compare it. We see a 5-point star and a 5-sided shape. Yes, a pentagon, but a 5-sided shape. If we look at these two, there's nothing in common. There are no shapes in common. Yes, there are colors in common, but we are only looking at shape. Then we look at this one, the third one, and we see a 5-point star, an 8-sided shape, or an octagon. So right now, these two have something in common, but if we really want to be true to the exercise, these two also have something in common. So we look at the final one, and we see a 5-point star and another 5-point star. But this is more rounded, so we're going to look at the pointy 5-point star. And as you can see, 3 of them have 5-point stars. Now you might argue, well, these 3 have the same color. That is true, but in the case of nonverbal, shape always overrules color, which is why we have it first in SPPANRSS. So we look for the one that is most important. And if there are no rules regarding shapes, then we go on to pattern, which is the color we'll look at next episode. Then we go on to curved and straight edges. So curved edges, of course, are very rounded, and straight edges are very straight lines. So let's look at the shapes, and we're going to see, does this have curved edges or straight edges? Of course, this has curved edges. What about this 4-sided shape? Straight edges, of course. What about the star? This is actually straight, because as you can see, the edges are very straight, but it's the corners that are rounded, so we put it in the straight edge side. What about this one? Also in the straight edge, because remember, it's the edges that we're considering here, not the corners. The arrow is also straight, the trapezium also straight, and the speech bubble also straight. As you can see, all the edges are straight. Now, looking at this, we can see it's the oval that's the odd one out, whereas the other shapes are all linked together because they all have straight edges. So if this were the criteria that we happened upon, we would say that this is the odd one out or the answer. But that's if we were to look at edges. What if there were no links in edges, but we had to look at corners instead? So we look at rounded versus pointy corners. We're going to look at the same shape and see how it looks different if we're considering corners instead of edges. So we start off with the same shapes. So the oval, of course, it's in the rounded section. The 4-sided shape, of course, in the pointy section. But now this time, the star will be with the oval because it has rounded corners. And remember, as we're looking at corners, we link those two together. The square in the rounded section, it's got rounded corners or rounded angles. The arrow. Now, this is pretty much rounded, very tiny rounded corners. This trapezium, of course, is in the pointy corner. Pointy does not mean acute, it just means very angular. And of course, and what about the speech bubble? The speech bubble actually goes in the rounded, but you might argue that, well, there are pointy corners here, there are angular corners. Just like everything, there are some caveats in nonverbal, and one of them, in this case, is being seen here. There are more rounded corners than there are pointy corners, and therefore we would group them in the rounded corners rather than with the pointy corners. Now what happens? Perhaps these two rules don't apply either. So nothing to do with the edges, no links in the corners either. What do we look at next? So we go on to regular versus irregular shapes. So regular shapes are, of course, shapes that have all these edges that are the same size and all the angles that are the same size, versus irregular shapes where they don't have any of that. Where does the oval go? Of course it goes in the irregular section. Remember, just because it's symmetrical does not mean it's regular. A regular version would be a circle. Where would this go? The four-sided shape. The four-sided shape now actually goes with the oval. And the reason for that, if you're confused, is because these two angles are not the same as these two angles. And all the angles have to be the same, not just the edges. What about the star? The star is actually considered, or the 5-point star in this case, is actually considered a regular shape because all the acute angles are the same and all the edges are the same. Now, you might argue that these reflex angles are not the same as the acute angles. In nonverbal, we don't consider those angles of the shape. Weirdly. In maths we do, in nonverbal we don't. What about the square? Notice how I said square. So of course it's in the regular section because of course squares are regular. The arrow would be irregular. Even though it's symmetrical, it's not a regular shape. None of the sides are the same, or rather all of the edges are not the same size and all of the angles are not the same size either. The trapezium is obviously in the irregular because none of the edges are the same and none of the angles are the same, and the speech bubble is also in the irregular. Now, as you can see, depending on what rule you decide to look at, how the shapes are classified changes. So it's really, really important you go through them in order to help you find and eliminate the wrong answers very, very quickly. So let's have a recap. So these are the criteria for shape in SPANRSS. First one being type of shape. What type of shape is present? Are there more triangular shapes? Are there more square type shapes? Are there more circular shapes? If that doesn't apply, we look for a particular type of shape. Perhaps it's a specific shape that's present in everything rather than a broad description of a shape. Perhaps it's a 5-pointed star, as we saw in the example. If that doesn't work either, we go on to curved versus straight edges. We see if there are more shapes with curved edges or straight edges. Then we move on to angles and we look at angles instead. If that doesn't work either, remember each one we move on to if the previous one didn't work or there were no rules that applied. So are there shapes with more rounded angles or pointy angles? And if that doesn't work, then we go on to regular versus irregular shapes and we try and group them and see if there's a rule. And if that doesn't work, then we go on to our next episode, which is pattern. And I'll see you in the next episode. And of course, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I will try my best to answer them as much as possible. And leave a like, subscribe, and share the video to your friends who might find it also helpful. Thank you for coming, and this is Exam Bytes Academy with SPANRSS.